Hi, I'm Torrance Downs. I'm a board member on the Cypress Cemetery Association and a member of the Old Saybrook Historical Society. We're here to do a tour of Cypress Cemetery. Just as a little background, Cypress Cemetery is about 10 acres. The eastern half of it is known as the Ancient Burial Ground, and the western half is the newer section called the Annex. The Ancient Burial Ground was laid out in 1635 when the Saybrook colony came here. So, let's get going. I'm standing at the grave of Lady Alice Fenwick, who, with her husband Colonel George Fenwick, came to the Saybrook colony in 1639, just 4 years after the colony started. Colonel Fenwick was one of the 15 patentees, as they were called, or leaseholders, who came to the colony. The other 14 didn't end up coming because the religious persecution that was going on at the time started to lessen, and apparently the other 14 decided that they didn't need to leave England. Lady Alice and Colonel Fenwick had 2 daughters. The eldest was Elizabeth, and she was born in 1642. The younger of the 2 was Dorothy, and she was born in 1645. Lady Alice unfortunately died shortly after that, likely from what was known as childbed fever at that time, likely infections or whatever that a new mother could get. When she died, Colonel Fenwick had her buried at a place down here towards the river that's called Tomb Hill. She was the only burial that occurred there, and she was there for 225 years. 225 years later, which was 1870, the Valley Railroad had plans to expand from up in Saybrook Center down here to Saybrook Point, and then to extend that over to Borough Fenwick. The townspeople, well, they didn't like the idea of her grave being destroyed, so they came down here with 3 doctors and dug up her grave and decided that they were going to take her up and then rebury her here. When they dug the grave up, they had a hard time finding her. Apparently she was buried quite deeply, but eventually they did, and they ended up finding the skeleton as well as some nails and other remnants of the coffin that had been there for 225 years. They also noted that her auburn hair was pretty much intact on that skeleton, so the 3 of them took 3 locks of her hair as mementos of this occasion, and one of those locks is actually on display at the Historical Society up on Main Street in Old Saybrook. Well, they pulled up her remains, her skeleton, and they carried it up to a house up on Main Street, cleaned it up, put it in a new coffin, and then took it over to the Saybrook Congregational Church, where they held a ceremony, and then they brought her back down in her new coffin to this location in Cypress Cemetery, where she's been buried ever since 1870. This is the Lin Family Plot. The Lins were a prominent family in Saybrook from the late 1600s into the 1700s. This is Nathaniel here, the patriarch of the Lin family here in Saybrook, and this is his wife Susanna Lind. Nathaniel was the son of a prominent merchant in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. His name was Simon Lind. Susanna was the daughter of a prominent official in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was the deputy governor at one time. The Linds here in Saybrook ended up with a lot of land. Simon Lind ended up giving Nathaniel about 16 acres here on the west side of the cemetery and land that extended along College Street. The other part of their land holdings were from the borough of Fenwick across Long Island Sound through Fenwood, Knollwood, and over to Cornfield Point. Nathaniel was very well known as the treasurer of the Saybrook Collegiate School, which became Yale College when it moved to New Haven, and what he did was he donated the use of his building on this 16 acres to the collegiate school for the use as the school as long as the school remained here on Saybrook Point. The Lins had a number of children. They had 11 altogether. Many of them are buried here. One in particular is their first daughter, who is Susanna Lind. She was born in 1685 and lived for 4.5 months, and therefore was the first burial here on this site. Being 1985, this is the stone that is original to the cemetery. It's the oldest stone in the cemetery. I'm here at the gravesite of Reverend Thomas Buckingham and his wife Hester Buckingham. Reverend Buckingham was notable for a number of reasons in Old Saybrook and in Connecticut. He was one of the early pastors of the Saybrook Congregational Church. In fact, he became pastor in 1665 at the age of 19. And part of the reason for that is that the pastor that he succeeded worked at the pulpit for a couple of years, but then apparently had a falling out with the church. So they needed a pastor to come in fairly quickly. So at 19 years old, Reverend Buckingham filled that gap. He wasn't officially ordained and appointed as the pastor until 1670, 5 years later. So he was a very young man. Another noteworthy thing that he did was that he was amongst 10 trustees that were successful in bringing the Saybrook Collegiate School to Saybrook Point. And again, we've mentioned before, Saybrook Collegiate School was the predecessor of Yale College when it moved to New Haven, and eventually Yale University. So Thomas Buckingham's prominence was partly one of the reasons why perhaps the Saybrook Collegiate School ended up here on Saybrook Point instead of up in Wethersfield or Hartford or even New Haven. Another important thing that Reverend Buckingham did was that he was among 16 people, 12 of which who were pastors and 4 of which who were laymen, that authored what was called the Saybrook Platform, which was basically a set of rules for all the independent congregational churches around the state. There was a worry that they were a little too independent, so this group got together to try to write some rules that would kind of bind them all together. Both his work with the Saybrook Collegiate School and the Saybrook Platform occurred within the last decade of his life. He died in 1709 and was buried here, as I said, with his wife Hester, a son Daniel over here, and other relatives that are buried around this plot. I'm standing here among 5 generations of the Hart family, one of the more prominent families in Old Saybrook history. The patriarch of this family is Reverend William Hart, and this is his wife, Mary Blegg Hart. They're buried right here. Reverend Hart was a pastor at the Saybrook Congregational Church for 48 years, which is quite a long time. They had 9 children together, 4 daughters and 5 sons. And the oldest son was General William Hart, and his grave is right over here. Well, General Hart was a very successful businessman. He was a shipping magnate, shipping to the West Indies. He was a politician. He was a military leader. He fought in the Revolutionary War, and he was also a land speculator, a very successful one at that. He ran for either governor or lieutenant governor 5 different times. He didn't succeed any of those times, but he ran. As a land speculator, he and numerous investors participated in the purchase of land in what was called the Connecticut Western Reserve. That was land that was given to Connecticut in reparation for the damages that occurred during the Revolutionary War caused by the British. Well, he and his investors bought that land, and when Connecticut residents started to migrate west to what was called New Connecticut, the investors and General Hart sold a lot of that land and made a tremendous amount of money. So by the time General Hart died, because of his shipping business and his land speculation, he was a very wealthy man. So let's take a look at some of the other grave sites here in the Hart plot. This is the Captain Elisha Hart family plot. Elisha Hart was General William Hart's youngest brother and the youngest son of Reverend William Hart. Elisha is buried here along with his wife Jeanette McCurdy Hart, whose family was from Old Lyme and were an important family as well. One of the things that the Elisha Hart family is known for is having 7 beautiful daughters. 2 of the daughters are buried right over here. Jeanette is in this location, and some of the other daughters are located elsewhere in this Hart family plot. The Harts, like many prominent families in Old Saybrook, had a number of slaves, and one in particular was named Leah Lathrop, and she was described as a big, pompous, superstitious black woman. And they loved her very much. They loved her so much that they wanted to bury her here in the Hart family plot. Now, at that time in the 1800s, that was very out of the ordinary. So in order to get permission to do that, Jeanette and some of her sisters offered the cemetery people that they would buy the black wrought iron fence that's located along College Street in front of the cemetery. And on the gates you actually see 2 plaques, one that says Hart and the other that says 1862, when that fence was put up. So the question is, was Leah Lathrop actually buried in this family plot? One of the conditions that the cemetery people made was that Leah could be buried in the plot, but the Harts couldn't inscribe her stone. So here in this family plot, there's an obelisk here. It's not inscribed, so we don't know who was actually buried here or actually what it signifies. But the thought is that potentially this is a marker for Leah, who was buried in the Hart family plot as a slave. I'm here at the grave sites of Frank Ransom, Phyllis Jackson, and Rose Jackson. These 3 were slaves owned by the Hart family. In the latter part of their lives, since they lived into the latter part of the 18th century, they would have likely been considered servants because slavery was outlawed in Connecticut in 1848. One interesting thing here is that, we know that there are a lot of slaves in the Saybrook colony. We just talked about the Lin family and 9 slaves that worked for Judge Samuel Lin. There are only a few graves here. Where are the rest of them buried? We don't know. We know about Leah Lathrop, or at least we suspect, who's in the Hart plot. But one of the interesting points about these graves is that if you look at the inscriptions on the stones, basically that means that the burial is on this side, and that means the head is on this side and the feet are on that side. Now, where we are on this property is south is this direction, north is this direction. So the fact that they're buried north or south to north is the opposite of all the other graves in the old burial ground, where the heads face north towards College Street and the feet face south. And it's thought that it's possible that the reason this is a reversed orientation is because they were slaves. We know that there are two other stones to the right that, because they're in this location, they could be slaves as well. Perhaps they were owned by the Hart family, but we don't know because the stones are broken and we can't see the inscriptions. Cypress Cemetery has many veterans buried here, from wars from the French and Indian War through the Revolutionary War, Civil War, all the way up to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In this case, this is the gravesite of Daniel Williams, who died during the Revolutionary War, but this is kind of an unusual story. First of all, this is a government-issued stone marking his grave. These are often used as footstones. That means that he's buried right here, and that would be his headstone, but it's unreadable, so we can't tell that that's Daniel. This is the information we have, and we know that he died at the Battle of Groton Heights at the age of 14. And the story is that he was very interested in that fort up there in Groton, and he was able to convince his father one time, when one of the soldiers from there came home on a furlough, he convinced his father to go up to that fort. And he did, and unfortunately it was the time when the British attacked that fort. So as a 14-year-old young man who really wasn't even in the Army, he was killed at that site and brought back here and buried. Again, another tragically cut short life. Daniel Williams at the age of 14. This is the gravesite of Giles Ward Jr. He was one of the veterans buried in the cemetery that died in action. In this case, Giles fought in the Civil War. He enlisted in the middle of the Civil War and was immediately assigned to the Army of the Potomac. And in 2 years' time, he became a real leader and was really respected by his soldiers as well as his leaders and commanders. The tragic story about Giles is that when his regiment were headed to New Bern, North Carolina, they put up at a house nearby where they expected to fight the next day. And he was sitting with his commander in one of the rooms in this house, and the commander was playing, probably carelessly, with a loaded pistol. And it went off, and the shot went, they think, right through Giles' heart, because he fell to the ground, never said a word, but he was dead. He was so well respected that his commanding officer, Brigadier General I.F. Palmer, was said to be really bereft at his loss. For his funeral, what they did was they brought his body to the steamship that brought him back north, and it was led by 50 to 60 officers. It was brought along by a band that played a solemn dirge, and his horse was led. But they put him on the steamship, and he was brought up to Brooklyn, New York, where his family lived, and they held a funeral ceremony there. And after that, he was brought back to Old Saybrook, where a ceremony was held at the Congregational Church. And it was said that the flags throughout the town were draped in black, and there was much tears and sobbing. Well, they held the ceremony, and then they brought him down here to this plot, which is his paternal grandfather's plot. Their family had a summer house here, so he had grown up at least during the summers here. And all of the people came down to this very plot here, and he was laid to rest with a lot of flowers being placed on his grave and on him by his comrades, and he was lowered into the ground. So this is the tragic story of a potential leader who his life was cut short at the age of 19. So that's Giles Ward Jr. This is the third gravesite we want to talk about in terms of veterans in this cemetery who have died in action. In this case, this is Harry Gilbert Falk, who died in World War I at the age of 20. He was a wagoneer, which in World War II parlance was basically a truck driver. He enlisted in Niantic and ended up over in France with the 101st Machine Gun Battalion. One night they were camping out in some forest areas as they were about to fight, and they were attacked, and there were a lot of injuries at the time, and Harry was one who was mortally wounded. He was taken to the field hospital and he died later that day, and he was buried in the American cemetery over there in France. Harry's father, Frederick Falk, who's also buried here in the family plot, went over to France in 1921 and had Harry exhumed so he could bring him back here to Old Saybrook and bury him in the family plot. One interesting note about Harry is that a national honor tree was planted here in his honor, and that's the oak tree that you see right back there. When it was planted, obviously it was a much smaller tree, and it had a brass plaque honoring Harry, and since that tree has grown up, the plaque has basically become engulfed in that tree. At such time that we have to take that tree down, the cemetery's intent is to recover that plaque, plant a new tree, and put the plaque up in honor of Harry. Another note is Harry's mother is buried right beside him. We've heard a lot about Gold Star families of late. The tradition was that a family that had a son or daughter fighting in a battle would hang a banner in their window that had a blue star on it. If that son or daughter was killed in action, that star would be replaced with a gold star. And to commemorate this family and Hilma Falk, she has a marker there that shows that she is a member of the Gold Star family. She's a Gold Star mother, a club that no mother wants to be a member of. This is the gravesite of Miss Anna James. Miss James was a longtime pharmacist in the town of Old Saybrook, and her pharmacy, the James Pharmacy, was located across Main Street from the Saybrook Congregational Church. She was, as I said, much beloved, but she was also noteworthy as being the first African-American woman pharmacist in the state of Connecticut. She was known to say that she had pharmacists in her family for as long as she can remember. Her brother Fritz, who's also buried here, had a pharmacy over in Old Lyme. She graduated from the Brooklyn School of Pharmacy in 1908 and worked in Hartford for a couple of years, and then in 1911 she came back to Old Saybrook, where she grew up, to work with her brother-in-law Peter Lane. Peter worked with her until 1917, when he went off and got a job as a drug wholesaler in Hartford. She stayed on, and by 1922 she owned the pharmacy and called it the James Pharmacy. As I said, she worked at the pharmacy for well over 50 years and lived in the apartment over James Pharmacy, and because of that proximity, the pharmacy was open 7 days a week, 365 days a year, except half days on Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. She retired in 1967 at the age of 81, and 10 years later in 1977 she passed away and was buried here with her brother Fritz. I'm standing here on the Yale Plot at the north end of the annex of Cypress Cemetery adjacent to College Street. This is the location of what's known as the Yale Boulder that commemorates this location as the first site of Yale College. Actually, it was the first site of the Saybrook Collegiate School that started here in 1701. The building itself wasn't located here on the Yale Plot. It was likely located about 400 feet to the west here at the corner of College Street and Willard Avenue. The property, though, is 16 acres from there over to the Yale Plot and back through the annex. So really, although not the site of the first building, most likely, it is the property where the Saybrook Collegiate School began that eventually became Yale College and today Yale University. Thank you for joining us on this virtual tour of Cypress Cemetery on Saybrook Point in Old Saybrook, Connecticut. And thank you to Swan Funeral Home of Old Saybrook for their sponsorship of this project. Finally, as one of the oldest continually operating cemeteries in North America, we have plots and columbarium niches available to Saybrook residents. Contact Cypress Cemetery Association for information.